Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Miriam Shadis. I'm here at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and I'm talking to Sara McDougall about her book, Royal Bastards, The Birth of Illegitimacy, 800 to 1250. Hi, Sara.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
I'm delighted to talk to you about this wonderful book. So why don't we start by you describing how it was you came to write this book. It's a little bit different from your previous book, and it yet related to law and sexuality and human behavior in the past. So tell us your inspiration for this book.
So I had no intention of writing this book at all. I had written a book about bigamy persecutions in 15th century northern France, which is what Miriam was very kindly alluding to before. I wrote that, and then I wrote some things about adultery to try to, in a way, clarify the difference between bigamy and adultery to my own satisfaction, as well as an answer of some questions that remained in my mind. And while I was doing that, I was particularly interested in trying to understand the circumstances of the women involved, the women and children both, but particularly the women. And so I came to see myself as trying to write a book about mistresses, about women who were in illicit relationships. And I was particularly interested in women in illicit relationships, or really women who were having illicit relations, because I'm quite confident that many of these relations were not as friendly as the term relationship implies. And I was trying to start with what I could find out about, which was mostly about men involved in these relations. It was very hard to find much about the women at all. And then I was looking at their children and what we knew about their children as a way to try to get back to the mothers who were my main interest. And I thought, well, but in order to understand all of this, I really had better understand the history of illegitimacy. What did it really mean to be an illegitimate child in the Middle Ages? I'm sure there's 8,000 books written on this. I will just read them, and then I can write a 2-paragraph introduction and get back to what I want to be doing, which is to be writing about the women and their circumstances. But in fact, I found that there was no such book. And what had been written about illegitimacy in the past, either in passing or there's a couple of things that try to look at either the illegitimate children of royalty in some cases, or the illegitimate children and what that meant for them for the priesthood. But the more I read it, the more problematic I found it. I think particularly because of my training in the history of gender and family, but also because of my legal training, which is, I suppose, what I had more formal training in anyway. And so what I had hoped was going to be 2 paragraphs rapidly turned into an overwhelming richness of material that found its way into a book that I had absolutely no intention of writing. I have a friend who makes fun of me because a dear friend who does not who does not hesitate to remind me of this, that I spent an entire year that I was on a sabbatical complaining because I really just wanted to write this article on illegitimacy, and I couldn't get it done. But what happened instead was I wrote a book.
Right.
So right now, I'm currently failing to write a book, and I'm really hoping that if I claim I'm writing an article, I might accidentally write a book, because otherwise I don't know how it's going to happen.
That's how it works out. Yeah. Well, so when you did write this book, right, you wrote a book that really, it's interesting because it challenges so many assumptions that people have been just kind of bumbling along with, you know, things that they know. And, you know, in that way, the book is kind of shocking. And I think, so that's a contribution, right? But it's also, well, why don't you explain what the book is about, okay? And what the argument of the book is, and maybe, you know, now that this book is on the shelf, now people have this book to go to, right? Where it fits in with other books, you know, what's its family, this book.
So where this fits in for medieval...
Explain the argument. Tell us the argument first.
Yeah, okay. So basically what I argue is that as we all knew and know all too well, unfortunately, even now in modern Western society, being illegitimate still has associations of shame and sin. And actually one of the really kind of heartbreaking things about writing this book was that people came up to me who'd read it or heard about it and told me that they were illegitimate, and told me about some of the consequences that they even now face, that they were kept out of the school that their parents wanted to send them to, just all kinds of horrific discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've always thought that, we have for a very long time thought that this idea that children born outside of marriage should be discriminated against. It is something that medieval Christian Europe came up with, and that the Catholic Church in particular came up with it and imposed it upon the society. And that this imposition worked, that it made it, in fact, very, very difficult for a person born outside marriage to inherit, and especially something like a kingdom, because that's not just, you know, a family property. That's something that has huge implications for everybody, and there's this quasi-sacral element to it sometimes that would seem to not work well with the idea of being born outside marriage. But as I argue, when you look at what actually was going on with the law and with practice and with the relationship of clergy and laity, and especially with the role of the church officials and their ideas in this, that's not actually the story that you see. So the first problem is that for quite a few centuries of what we cheerfully refer to as the Middle Ages, so from 500 to 1500, give or take, for several centuries, it was extremely difficult to, or for us trying to generalize about marriage. It's very hard to say what is in fact a legitimate marriage. There were a bunch of different ideas of what marriage ought to be, and they did not align rather well. And you could end up with 5 or 6 different ideas, and there wasn't one idea that was the church's idea, and there wasn't one idea that was the lady's idea, because there were no such solid institutions. People were involved in all of the above.
Right.
Even among church people, there could be a whole bunch of different ideas, and it varied from region to region and so on and so forth. And so if there's no such thing as legitimate marriage, that makes there being something like a legitimate birth to that union rather difficult to pin down. So that was one thing I found.
Right.
Other thing that I found was that there are all of these children born outside of what seemed to look like marriage, who were nevertheless becoming king or queen even. And there were also a number of children born to legitimate unions who were being excluded.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that looked fishy. And so I started revisiting a lot of the famous cases and some of the less famous cases, famous for medievalist apologies.
Right.
Non-medievalist.
You don't know about Agnes and Moran?
Yeah, what? This what the really? Okay. So and what became really clear once I took a careful look at all of the language, especially from texts that were written at the time, there was a real interest in something that looks like marriage, but that isn't marriage. It's not marriage, it's the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And those are not the same thing. It's a very easy mistake to make because the most important woman in a story, the most powerful woman in a story is often the wife, is treated as the wife, but that was because she was important. And she was often important for her ancestry. And so what I started to notice, thanks in large part to scholars like you, Miriam, who've been, pointing out how important women and female lineage were for all these years, it's because of work like people like you that I was able to put together that what people were caring about was not legitimate marriage or its absence so much as, is your mother an ancestor? Does she have the kind of lineage that makes this dynasty look good?
Right.
That was especially important if it was if the male ruler or wannabe ruler didn't actually have a claim of his own. So if he was a conqueror who wanted legitimacy in a new kingdom, if he could marry the daughter of the king he deposed, that, for lack of a better word, koshered his claim. And then in another scenario, if you have a man who had in his life, so if a king had multiple relations with different women, some wives, some not, some may be called legitimate, some not, some both, the child among those various unions with the best claim would usually be the one whose mother had the best ancestry. And so that is a far more consistent answer to why succession worked the way it did than any ideas of illegitimacy or legitimacy that took a really long time to evolve.
So it's just coincidental that many women were also wives and thus mothers of heirs, right? Because really what they were women who had, could trace their lineage back to Charlemagne or something, and therefore they were the mothers of the heir.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So it's that you are treated as a wife as a consequence of who you are.
Yeah. It's so interesting because it lets us look at a whole bunch of relationships, and not just in terms of illegitimacy, but thinking about all kinds of things and the way they work in this way. So now explain a little bit the contribution. Where does this book fit in with other books? And you're pretty clear about you're always kind, but you're pretty clear about the mistakes that people have made, the assumptions that historians have made. How do you fit this one into in with other books? You know, what do you hope people will read next to your book?
So my main hope is that people take away from it. So I want political historians to be forced to care about gender.
Uh-huh.
That and family.
Yeah.
I want this book to be sitting next to standard histories of royal politics and the workings of royal politics. I want people who are interested in legal history to understand how illegitimacy was constructed and reconstructed, and that it wasn't something that it was imposed, that it was opportunistic, and that the attitude of church officials has really been misunderstood as more aggressive than it actually was, at least as concerns the rights of somebody born to an illicit union, which I hope has some implications for how we treat people now.
Right.
What else would I think?
Wait, let me ask you a question that this just made me think of. What do you think it was that prompted the eventual sort of, you know, focus on illegitimacy as a real problem in these things, you know, where you have people seeking dispensations or people being cut out without question, you know, about these relationships. I mean, think about the English and the Tudors and, you know, why they just, you know, Henry VIII was not able to choose his son as his heir, right? But at what point did illegitimacy become, and why did it become such a thing?
So in some ways, the turning point is when the book ends, which was my way of saying, I'm done.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's still not done. I mean, in a way, illegitimacy becomes a useful strategic weapon, and it was recognized as such, and so it became something that people wanted to use, and it became important for people to use for family matters because it became increasingly difficult to exclude someone who was a child, you know, your children. As you lose freedom over who gets to be your heir, you want there to be a way to redefine who your heir is. So that's one of the reasons I see this starting to happen. And then it also becomes an opportunity for royal and church officials both to have a mediating role, because they developed for themselves the power to say either you are legitimate or you are not legitimate, or I declare you legitimate for the purposes of this inheritance. Right. Or I can't say that you're legitimate, but even though you're illegitimate, it's still okay for you to be the bishop, the king, something like that. So it becomes an opportunity for the people who take on that power to have a role, and then they get to be the decision maker, right? Which is a nice thing to get to do, because then they owe you. So it just creates all kinds of possibilities, and it becomes an opportunity for an aunt to exclude from succession a nephew, or from inheritance, right? So it just becomes recognized as something that you can use to make your life better or make someone else's life worse, or to resolve a dispute. And once you've created that possibility, it's hard to stop yourself, I suppose.
Right. We are almost out of time.
Wow.
I know, but I actually have a couple more questions. So let me ask them and then decide what you want to say and how far we want to go with this. I'm curious if there was, well, I have lots of questions. I'm curious about anything that really surprised you once you started to dig down into this. Like, did you find a story that was shocking, or just a way of thinking that was new or surprising to you? I'm curious if there was anything that couldn't go in the book, that you just had to take out because you didn't have room for it, or it wasn't fitting in quite right, but was an important part of the story. And I'm wondering where it's leading you now, this material. So you don't have to answer all those questions, but those are questions I have.
I'm so thrilled that you have those questions. So there was a lot actually that I left out, just because I was already casting a wider net than was necessarily sustainable. I'm glad I was able to get it all out. So there was a lot more I wanted to say, in particular about Iberia, and where and if Iberia is so different from the rest of Europe, and are things exceptional or not. I really wanted to dig deeper into those bewilderingly wonderful lineage where everyone, male and female, has the exact same name around, and then rendered sometimes in Castilian and sometimes in Portuguese, or sometimes in Navarrese, or I don't know, into the spelling. I wanted to really dig into that and try to understand those relationships, because there is so much violation of the canon law of marriage as it comes to be formed, in particularly the rules about who you can and can't lawfully marry, because at least by the 13th century there was enough clarity that it was,
they knew,
fairly clear that you knew that you weren't supposed to marry your first cousin, and especially since you just had your marriage annulled to your second cousin, it's possible that you shouldn't marry your first cousin, and you really did know that she was your first cousin.
Right.
That one is something
right.
Anyway, so I did want to get more into that, but I decided to leave it to experts like you.
Let's see what happens there.
And so that's something I wish that I had been able to do more with. And also because I wanted to do more also with the images, because there's such a rich material culture that could be brought into this story, that I would really love to see. But in the end, I was more eager to set that all aside and work instead on what I'm working on now, which is, in a way, what I had tried to do all along, which is to try to understand what it was to be a woman who was in some kind of non-marital relation with a man and became pregnant as a result, and what she could do, what was done to, for, or by her, what could be done, or she ought to be done, or wasn't done to, by, for the child. And in my back in my more normal stomping ground of France, where at least I am more solidly on top of the languages in question, and can try to dig into that. So one thing I did want to try to deal with was how the handling of illegitimacy among royalty compared to the handling of illegitimacy for priests, and so I did write about that. So that's I mean, there's a lot more to say. That's basically where I've left things in that people can pick up.
I read some wills in Portugal a couple years ago, and it wasn't what I was working on, but I found this will and I read it, and it was a priest's will, and it was really long and detailed, and all this stuff that he was giving away, and he had this whole section about his about not his children, but these children that were in his household, and he was making sure that they had this and that, and that she would have a dowry or a dower, and the son would have this, and there was this conversation at one point where he makes a comment about how, people aren't perfect. He's like, people aren't perfect, and here are these children that I'm going to supply, with all this, this inheritance, and it was clearly his kids, and their mother, and
that is fabulous.
It was great. I hope I took good notes on it. I mean, I think a lot of those wills have actually been published, and I think you could probably find them. But it's always surprising, and it's surprising that we're surprised, right? We are the ones with the problem. We're the ones who are going like, what, and
right.
And the people around them really were not.
Right. Well, I mean, we have this bad habit of thinking that it would actually be possible for a priest to somehow live in some kind of perfect, chaste isolation, when in fact he must have had some kind of household, or at least he wasn't living alone, probably.
No, they lived with their families. They lived with families that they built. This is Michelle Armstrong Partito's work, or Jennifer Thibodeau too, the manly priest, right? Like there's all this work out there that is on this for medieval people.
Yeah, and this is real family life. And did they get told that they had to, drive these women and children out of their homes? Yes, but they seem to have been able to go back in, and there was at least some effort to do something. Like we've been able, you have been able to find, and I've been able to find examples where the man actually tries and seems to, at least in some cases, succeed in providing something for the children, for the mother, sometimes a marriage for the mother herself, to another man, or sometimes to his bed, which is a pretty significant gift. And there's just there is a rich family life that that scholars who work in this area have started to uncover, that shocks us, but as you said, wouldn't have shocked them. And it certainly isn't only a Mediterranean phenomenon. It's just we happen to know more about it in the Mediterranean, and we're trying to, those of us who work in less interesting parts of Europe are trying to catch up. But it's a really complicated, interesting world in which some horrible things happened to women in these illicit relations, also, and to the children, to be sure. But I feel like it's so important that we don't just focus on those stories, which are in fact actually kind of hard to find. And that in fact we bring into them the things that we do know and have found, like these wills. I think wills are a fabulous source to get at the history of childhood and children. Yeah.
Wow. Well, on that note, is there anything else you want to say to our public here?
That they should read your book too.
Sure.
Philip Castile, I gave you a little hint.
Yeah. My book is well, it's interesting because your discussion of Fernando had to make me go back and think about a lot of things and think about what I thought. I didn't talk about his legitimacy or illegitimacy per se, I don't think. But it wasn't just something I just kind of took it for granted. It was a very interesting challenge at the end of the day to think about these things. At the end of the day, I think we can agree that the people involved in all this, just did not care, right? That this was not their concern. Their concern was, they had concerns about purity. They had concerns about privilege and rightness, legitimacy in the sense that they wanted to be authorized, right, to do what they were doing. And they claimed various kinds of ways to do that. So they looked at their mothers, is what you're saying. And that makes sense to me. So no, I think we're good. This has been fun.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for sticking out this whole podcast.
Yeah, we were talking about royal bastards,
Yeah.
by the way, right? The Birth of Illegitimacy, 800 to 1250. The best dates, really.
Well, thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Shisai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.